But the presumption that there is the chance to save the life without objection is critical, and that's why in Spain it's worked so effectively. So I would urge Roger, as a patient advocate and a relatives advocate, to think about the relatives of those who are dying and to think about the best interests of the relatives of those who are the potential donors.
The way to overcome this business of regretting not giving consent is public education into the advantages of transplantation, not forcing people or pushing people. Well, it's a sort of it's a paternalistic, rather authoritarian.
No,
if you don't
none of
object,
those things.
but my main concern with presumed consent is that it's distorting the debate about how to get more donors. It's going to be expensive, and there's no evidence that it's going to actually give us more donors. Let me quote you the director of the Spanish organ donation system. He says, Spain does not have an opt-out register for those who do not wish to become organ donors. Clearly, the presumed consent law in Spain is dormant. Spain's outstanding deceased organ donation rate cannot reasonably be attributed to its presumed consent laws. Once you hear that guy saying that,
it's just one guy who says
he's
it's all
the director.
I know, and that
he's the
guy
director
says,
of the
that
prime.
guy says, "Aren't I brilliant? It's all down to me." Now, Spain has a fantastic system. But I don't think that someone who has a vested interest in saying how good the system is. Well, no, it's not
That's
at all.
Absolutely
I
disgraceful.
just think you've got to look
I
at
hope
the broader...
Raphael listens to this.
Well, I've met him on several occasions. I've said to him he's entitled to his view, but he shouldn't dictate for this country. And I'd like to ask you, John, what your solution is, because I have to say there has been public education programme after public education programme from donor cards onwards about this. Now, unless there is a Faber-esque proposal that everyone else has missed out on, I don't see how you're going to get the step change, because I'll support anything that would have an effect.
Well, one thing we shouldn't support is something that is not going to be effective. That's got to be step one. Step two, then, is to look at the situation and say, what do we need? Our intensive care facilities are poor in relation to Europe. The number of potential donors in our units is about half that of Spain. That's a key issue. Then we come to the issue of detecting donors once they're in the intensive care unit and they're dying, early detection. Now, after the task force report in 2008, the government brought in much improved coordination, and since 2008 we've had about a 25% increase in organ donors in the UK.
Cadaveric organ donors. The increase has been solely due to living donors. If you look at the figures, the number of transplants has been stable. We have failed. They set a target 5 years ago, nearly 5 years ago, saying they want to see a 50% increase in the number of cadaveric organ donors. They are nowhere near, I think John would agree, the 50% increase they set as a target.
There has been
nowhere near. It's failed.
The cadaveric donors has gone up from around 800 to over 1,000. Well, now, Evan, if you don't know that, you shouldn't be debating.
Even if you accept that, that's 25%. It's not 50%, and it's stable.
No, but it's when they
everyone accepts it's failed. No, everyone accepts they haven't reached 50%.
That's outrageous.
Well, you can claim no one's dying, but everyone knows people are dying while waiting. We have not solved the problem.
Let's also broaden this debate out as well, because the idea of what's called elective ventilation is also one of the other things being discussed in this report. Simply put, it means keeping people alive, ventilated long enough for their organs to be removed and used for transplantation. Roger Goss, is that something that you would be in favour of?
We don't have a problem with it, provided that the patient and or the relatives have agreed to this. The real problem with it is, given John's previous point about the lack of intensive care beds. If you start moving lots of people under elective ventilation into intensive care, what the heck are you going to do then when people come in an emergency condition who are judged to be savable? Do you then throw the other people out, or you leave the people coming in to die?
So you don't object to the principle of elective ventilation?
Subject to it's agreed by the people involved, the patient and or the relatives.
Relatives aren't able, in any ethical system that I'm aware of, to give consent for intrusive treatment for a patient. They are often consulted by doctors who have to make the decision on a best interest test, and that's been established medical practice for decades and is effectively the common law. So to suddenly say that relatives can say, even where it's not in the best interest of the patient, we want this done, that's not what's being proposed. The problem is, ethically, that we don't at the moment impose intrusive treatment, interventions on people that are not for their benefit, whatever the otherwise good motives might be, because that is very authoritarian, and who knows where that might lead in principle. It's an extremely difficult area. That's why it's not one of these simple things that hadn't been thought of before.
Just a reminder, you're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. Today I'm discussing the ethics of organ donation with my guests, Roger Goss, Evan Harris and John Faber.
Elective ventilation was a big issue 20 years ago. I was president of the BTS at the time, British Transplant Society. We drew up guidelines. We agreed a discussion document. Virtually all transplant centres were in favour of elective ventilation, and the government came down and said no. For the simple reason that it's a physician's legal duty that the intention of his therapy be for the benefit of the patient. And 20 years ago, this was very narrowly interpreted as to their physical benefit. And so it was dropped, and we were all incredibly disappointed. But it's now a non-issue, because over the past 20 years, the definition of a patient's best interest has been broadened to include their wishes with regard to organ donation. So that if we know that a patient who is in a coma and close to death, that if we know that they wanted to be an organ donor, we can take that into account in assessing a treatment.
Roger Goss, I think everyone around the table obviously agrees that there's a problem. Were you to give a prescription for solving the problem, what would it be? What do you really want to see?
One, we would pass regulations that everybody who was a potential donor was, in fact, sought their opinion on whether they wanted to be. Secondly, we would encourage GPs to raise the issue. I know they're asked to raise every issue under the sun during consultations. We would encourage hospitals to raise the issue when people were coming in for treatment. God forbid that anything goes wrong, would you want to consider this as an option? And we would try and ensure that in schools it was part of the curriculum, the whole subject of organ donation.
Evan Harris, I mean, have you been surprised by the reaction that there's been to the BMA reports?
No, I mean, can I first say that Roger's idea is very interesting, but they fundamentally don't deal with human nature, which is that no matter how
Nor
much
does presumed consent, which is exactly the same problem, that people are not going to think about it, even though they're widely told they're going to have this huge education effort. In fact, people won't want to do it. They did a study after the setting up of summary care records, putting them onto computer. We said that should only be done with patients' permissions. They said, oh no, it'll be an opt-out system and everybody will be fully informed. Everybody got a letter and whatnot. And after the event, when the Imperial College London, Professor Greenhalgh did the study, the conclusion was the majority of people didn't even know the system had been introduced, let alone that they had an opt-out right. That's reality.
I come back to the BMA's position. We think that the evidence is clear that the most effective way of increasing the number of organs made available in an ethical way is through an opt-out system. That's better for donors because it respects their wishes more often. It saves more lives. That's what the evidence suggests. And it's kinder on relatives who are less likely to regret a decision that they make at the height of their grief.
John, we're nearly out of time, but let me just bring in John Faber.
I'm mystified at why the BMA believes presumed consent will increase organ donation. Because there's really no evidence for it. It's going to be expensive.
Review said 11 out of 12 papers were suggestive
and
of
the
it.
21 specialists on the task force decided that the papers were defective, that the interpretation was not correct.
But in terms of what we should do.
The key is most organ donors die in intensive care units. You've got to have a good infrastructure of intensive care to increase your organ donation, but that's a very difficult and expensive long-term thing. The second is, once you're in the intensive care unit and you're dying, then you've got to be picked up early enough before you deteriorate and die to be given the opportunity to become an organ donor. That's one of the easiest ways to improve organ donation. And this is where the extra 200 and more donors have come per annum in the last few years. The third, of course, is consent. And consent, you're not going to legislate for consent.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. But my thanks today to my guests, Roger Goss, Dr. Evan Harris, and Professor John Faber. You're listening to Scott Craig on The Voice of Russia. Stay with us.